It's 9 o'clock in the morning, Friday, June 14th. The sun is just starting to burn off the last of the morning dew, and the air has that perfect early summer smell of damp earth and chlorophyll. From where I'm standing by the back steps of the house I bought with my wife 3 years ago, I can see my entire kingdom. It's not much, just a 15 by 20 foot patch of land, but it's mine. I built it. Every handful of soil, every stone in the border, every single plant straining towards the light, it all started in my head and was brought to life by my own 2 hands. For the last 2.5 years, this garden has been my sanctuary. It's the place I go to unwind, to feel the solid, reassuring texture of soil under my fingernails, to watch something grow from a tiny, hopeful seed into a living, breathing thing. I'm 36 years old, and in a world that feels increasingly disconnected, this little plot of land is my anchor. It's real. It's honest. And until recently, it was peaceful. But this morning, peace is the last thing I feel. My stomach is a tight knot of anxiety. My coffee is growing cold in my hand, untouched. My eyes keep drifting to one specific spot, the back left corner, the corner plot. To anyone else, it would look unremarkable. A few mounds of freshly turned dirt, a bit of mulch, nothing out of the ordinary. But I know what's buried there. I know what I did last night under the cover of darkness. I can still feel the phantom sensation of the thick, protective gloves on my hands as I carefully placed 5 little secrets into the earth. 5 leafy little soldiers now standing guard. The source of my anxiety has a name, Brenda. She's my mother-in-law. She's 64, physically fit, and possesses a level of self-confidence that could deflect an asteroid. In her own mind, she is a world-class horticulturalist. In reality, her gardening philosophy is a scorched earth policy, delivered with a loving smile. She calls it helping. I call it sabotage. For the past year, ever since she decided my garden was her personal pet project, every visit has been a prelude to a new disaster. It's a special kind of tyranny, the kind that comes disguised as a favor. She arrives with her own trowel and a bag of discount store fertilizer, her eyes scanning my work for any perceived flaw she can exploit under the guise of improvement. "Oh, Cameron," she'll say, her voice dripping with concern, "that looks a little leggy. Let me just fix that for you." And I can't say no. Not really. How do you tell your spouse's mother, who is just so eager to help that her help is about as welcome as a biblical plague of locusts? You can't. You just smile through gritted teeth and spend the next week trying to undo the damage. The war started quietly, a slow campaign of attrition. It began last spring with my prize rose bushes. They weren't just any roses. They were a specific variety I had spent months sourcing, a deep, velvety crimson that looked almost black in the twilight. They were my pride and joy. I had nurtured them from bare root stalks, feeding them, pruning them with surgical precision, talking to them probably more than is considered sane. By their second year, they were magnificent, covered in buds that promised a spectacular season. Brenda came to visit on a Saturday in late April. I had to run to the hardware store for a new sprinkler head, a trip that should have taken an hour tops. I left her sitting on the patio with a glass of iced tea. When I got back, I saw her in the garden, humming a cheerful tune, a pair of rusty shears in her hand. My blood ran cold. She was standing over the mangled remains of my rose bushes. She hadn't just pruned them, she had butchered them. She'd given them what she called a hard reset. All the promising new growth, all the dozens of swelling buds, all the potential of the coming season gone. In their place were knobby, arthritic-looking sticks, cut back so severely they looked like they were recoiling in shock. There were maybe 6 inches of cane left above the ground. She beamed at me, wiping a smudge of dirt from her cheek. There she announced, as if she'd just unveiled a masterpiece, "They'll thank me for this next year. You have to be cruel to be kind with roses, Cameron. It encourages vigorous growth." I just stood there, speechless. The shears in her hand looked like a weapon. I could feel a hot, helpless anger rising in my chest. I wanted to scream to ask her what on earth gave her the right to destroy a year of my work without so much as asking. But I couldn't. My wife was standing in the doorway, smiling, happy that her mom was taking an interest in my hobby. So I swallowed the rage. I bit my tongue so hard I tasted metal. "Thanks, Brenda," I managed to choke out. "I'm sure you know best." The roses did not, in fact, thank her. They spent the entire summer in a state of traumatic shock, putting out a few desperate leafy shoots, but not a single flower. My prize-winning bushes were barren sticks, all season a constant silent monument to her helpfulness. Every time I looked at them, I felt that same surge of impotent fury. She had violated my sanctuary. She had come into my space and with the best of intentions and the worst of results, wrecked a piece of it. And the worst part, she never saw it as a mistake. In her version of events, she'd done me a massive favor. That incident set the tone for everything that followed. Her help became more frequent, more brazen. She'd pull up seedlings she didn't recognize, convinced they were weeds. She'd over-fertilize delicate plants, burning their roots. She'd rearrange my carefully planned vegetable beds to what she considered a more aesthetically pleasing layout, ignoring the principles of companion planting I'd spent weeks researching. Each time I would have to just nod and thank her because challenging her meant starting a family war I wasn't prepared to fight. So I adapted. I tried scheduling my gardening for times I knew she wouldn't be around. I put up little polite signs labeling new plants. It didn't work. The memory of those butchered roses is still vivid. That feeling of violation of having my passion dismissed and my work destroyed is the fuel for what I've done. What happened 3 days ago was the final straw, an escalation I couldn't ignore. She finally went after the heart of the garden, and in doing so, she declared a war she has no idea she's about to lose. I take a slow sip of my now lukewarm coffee. The sun is higher, its rays warming the back of my neck. I can hear the birds chirping, the distant hum of traffic starting its day. Everything seems so normal, so peaceful. But it's the calm before the storm. Brenda is coming for the weekend. Sooner or later, her path of well-intentioned destruction will lead her right back to that corner plot. It always does. But this time, the garden is ready for her. This time, the garden will fight back. It all came to a head this past Tuesday, June 11th, 3 days ago. It feels like a lifetime. I had to work late one of those days where the clock on the wall seems to be moving backward. I was stuck in a windowless conference room arguing about quarterly projections and synergy, my mind drifting back to my garden, specifically to the corner plot. That's where the magic was happening this year. For the last 2.5 years since I first broke ground on this 15-20-foot patch of dirt, the corner plot has been my laboratory. It gets the best morning sun, and it's the most sheltered from the wind. It's where I try the ambitious stuff, the finicky varietals, the plants that need a little more babying. This year, it was dedicated to one thing: heirloom tomatoes. Not just any heirlooms. I had spent the entire winter researching, poring over seed catalogs and gardening forums. I tracked down seeds for 3 specific types varieties, known for their incredible flavor, but also for being notoriously difficult to grow. There was the Black Crim, a dark, smoky-flavored tomato from the Crimean Peninsula, the green zebra with its beautiful striped skin and tangy, complex taste, and my holy grail, the pineapple pig, a massive bicolor tomato that supposedly tasted like a tropical fruit. These weren't just plants to me. They were a challenge, a passion project. I started them from seed back in February under grow lights in my basement. I nurtured them, repotted them, hardened them off for weeks, getting them accustomed to the outdoors before finally planting them in the richest, most carefully amended soil in my entire garden. I'd built special trellises for them, designed for optimal air circulation to prevent the very diseases they were prone to. I was documenting their growth weekly, taking photos, measuring their height. I had my sights set on the blue ribbon at the county fair in August. It might sound silly to an outsider, but to me, it was a validation of all the hours, the sweat, and the care I'd poured into this little piece of earth. Those tomatoes were my pride and joy. I finally got home around 7:30 that evening. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the lawn. I was exhausted, mentally drained from my day. All I wanted to do was grab a cold drink, walk out to the garden, and just be there. Check on the progress. See if any of the pineapple pigs had started to blush from green to yellow. It's my form of meditation, my way of decompressing. I walked around the side of the house, and from about 50 feet away, I knew something was wrong. Terribly wrong. The corner of the garden just looked empty. The tall, lush green foliage that had been there that morning was gone. The sturdy 7-foot trellises stood bare against the evening sky like skeletons. For a second, my brain refused to process it. Did a deer get in a groundhog? But the fence was intact. There was no sign of an animal attack. I started walking faster, a knot of ice forming in my stomach. Then I saw it. Lying in a heap next to the compost bin was a mountain of green, a tangled, wilted massacre of leaves, stems, and tiny, unripened fruit. My black crims, my green zebras, my pineapple pigs, all of it, ripped out of the ground, root and stem. I just stood there staring at the pile of dead and dying plants. The sheer violence of it was shocking. They hadn't been clipped or pruned. They had been torn out, yanked from the soil with a brutal force that had snapped the main stems. Little green tomatoes the size of marbles and golf balls were scattered on the ground like discarded ammunition. A season's worth of work, a year's worth of hope, lying dead at my feet. My wife found me there a few minutes later, standing motionless, just staring. She saw the look on my face, followed my gaze to the pile of green, and her own face fell. "Oh, Cam, oh no," she whispered. "What happened?" I asked, my voice flat hollow. She winced. "My mom came by this afternoon. She wanted to drop off some mail that came to her house by mistake." The knot in my stomach tightened into a ball of cold, hard lead. Brenda. Of course. It was always Brenda. She called me about an hour ago. My wife continued choosing her words carefully. She said she noticed some blight on your tomato plants in the corner. She was worried it would spread to the rest of the garden, so she took care of it for you. She said she was doing you a favor. A favor. The word echoed in the sudden, ringing silence of my mind. The same way butchering my roses was a hard reset. The same way pulling up my onion seedlings was weeding. She had looked at my prize-winning, meticulously cared-for tomato plants, the healthiest things in the entire garden, and in her infinite, unassailable wisdom, she had diagnosed a phantom illness and performed a radical, scorched earth surgery. I finally moved. I walked over to the corner plot and knelt down. The soil was disturbed, pockmarked with the craters where my plants had once stood. I could see the clean white ends of roots that had been snapped off deep in the earth. There was no blight. There was no disease. I knew my plants. I inspected them daily. There might have been a yellowing leaf here or there, a touch of sun scald on a stem, normal things. But blight, no. Not a chance. She had seen something she didn't understand, something that looked maybe a little wild and unruly to her hyper-manicured sensibilities, and she had passed judgment. The execution was swift and merciless. I didn't say anything for a long time. I just knelt there in the dirt, the scent of crushed tomato leaves hanging in the air. It's a clean, sharp, wonderful smell, but that night it smelled like death. My wife put a hand on my shoulder. She knew. She knew how much this meant to me. "I'm so sorry, honey," she said softly. "I know how hard you worked on them. I'll talk to her." Later that night she did. I sat on the couch listening to my wife's side of the phone conversation. It was a master class in diplomacy, trying to gently explain the magnitude of the disaster without starting World War III. Her voice was calm, but I could hear the tension. "Mom, yes, I know you were trying to help. But Cameron spent months on those specific plants. No, they weren't sick. They're a special variety. They're supposed to look like that." "Yes, I'm sure." "Well, he's very upset, Mom. It was his main project for the year." I could faintly hear Brenda's voice through the receiver, high-pitched and defensive. I could imagine her perfectly sitting in her pristine living room, 64 years old and utterly convinced of her own expertise. She wasn't apologizing. She was doubling down. She was the hero of this story. She had saved my garden from my own neglect. She was explaining patiently, as if to a child, the dangers of late blight, how it could wipe out an entire crop overnight. She'd seen a spot on a leaf, she claimed, and she just knew. She had acted decisively, a garden vigilante, protecting the innocent cucumbers and peppers from their diseased neighbors. The conversation ended with my wife looking exhausted and me feeling nothing but a cold, crystalline rage. Brenda felt no remorse. In her mind, I should be grateful. She had performed a service. Any distress I was feeling was just the childish overreaction of an amateur who didn't know any better. That was the moment something inside me broke. For a year, I had tolerated it. I had swallowed my anger over the roses. I had replanted the seedlings she'd mistaken for weeds. I had patiently explained companion planting to her, only to have her ignore me. I had absorbed every piece of unsolicited, terrible advice. I had smiled and nodded and said, "Thanks, Brenda," through gritted teeth, all to keep the peace. For my wife. For the family. But this was different. This wasn't just a mistake. This was a fundamental violation. It was the complete and utter dismissal of my passion, my knowledge, and my work. She hadn't just pulled up some plants. She had ripped up a piece of my identity and thrown it on the compost pile and then called it a favor. She had, with all the confidence of blissful ignorance, destroyed the one thing that brought me peace. I went to bed that night, but I didn't sleep. I just lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling. The image of those bare trellises burned into my mind. The anger wasn't hot anymore. It had cooled into something hard and sharp. The policy of appeasement was over. The strategy of biting my tongue had failed. She had proven that she could not be reasoned with. She would not learn. She would not respect my boundaries, no matter how clearly I stated them. Polite signs and gentle conversations were useless. She operated on a different level, a plane of existence where her intentions were all that mattered, and the consequences of her actions were irrelevant. Okay, I thought. Fine. If she can't be taught with words, she'll have to be taught with consequences. Natural consequences. An idea began to form in the darkness. It was a wild, dangerous idea, but it felt right. It felt proportional. She sees my garden as a wild, untamed thing that needs her brand of brutal intervention. She sees threats where there are none. What if I thought there was a real threat? Something quiet and hidden, something that looked innocent enough to an untrained eye. She loves to get her hands in my soil, to impose her will on my little patch of earth. So be it. I would let the earth itself teach her the lesson she refused to learn from me. I would use the wildness she so feared as a weapon, a passive defense system. My garden had been trespassed upon, violated. It was time to build a wall, not of brick or wood, but of leaf and stem. A biological fence powered by nature's own arsenal. My plan was set. Brenda had destroyed my sanctuary. Now I was going to turn that sanctuary into a trap tailored specifically for her. She was coming back for the weekend, and she would inevitably be drawn back to the scene of her triumph, the corner plot, looking for more things to fix. But this time, the plot would be ready for her. This time, when she reached down to impose her will, the garden itself would deliver a message in a language so clear, so visceral, that not even she could ignore it. The next morning I drove. I didn't go to the garden center. What I needed couldn't be bought from a neatly labeled rack under the sterile lights of a big box store. I needed something authentic, something local. I drove 2 miles out of my subdivision to a stretch of road that ran alongside a public easement, a forgotten strip of land where the manicured lawns gave way to wild, untamed nature. This was her territory, metaphorically speaking. The chaos she was always trying to conquer in my garden existed here in its purest form. I parked my car and got out. I had dressed for the occasion. Long-sleeved work shirt, thick denim jeans tucked into my boots, and a pair of heavy leather gardening gloves that went halfway up my forearms. I felt like a biologist heading into a hazardous zone, which in a way, I was. I walked along the edge of the woods, my eyes scanning the undergrowth. I was looking for a very specific plant, a three-leaved master of camouflage, a quiet resident of the forest floor that packs an outsized punch, Toxicodendron radicans, eastern poison ivy. It didn't take long to find it. A healthy, thriving patch of it, climbing up the trunk of an old oak tree, its glossy green leaves, looking deceptively beautiful in the dappled sunlight. I found what I was looking for near the base, several young, healthy seedlings pushing their way up through the leaf litter. They were perfect, small enough to be easily transplanted, but mature enough to have their full chemical arsenal ready to go. Using a small trowel, I carefully, almost surgically, dug around the root systems of 5 separate seedlings. I treated them with the respect a bomb disposal expert gives an unexploded ordnance. Each movement was deliberate. I lifted them, roots and soil intact, and placed them into separate plastic pots I'd brought with me. 5 of them. A nice round number. I placed the pots in a cardboard box in my trunk, stripped off my gloves, and drove home, a strange sense of calm settling over me. I had the solution. I had the cure for Brenda. That night, under the cover of darkness, I went back to my garden. The air was cool and still. The only light came from a sliver of moon and the distant glow of a street lamp. I carried the 5 little pots to the scene of the crime, the corner plot. The earth was still disturbed where Brenda had ripped my tomatoes out just 2 days prior. It felt like walking onto a battlefield after the fighting was over. With my trowel, I dug 5 small holes, spacing them out strategically. I didn't bunch them together. I interspersed them among some of the wild violets and creeping Charlie that I tolerate along the edges. I wanted them to look like they belonged there, just another random weed that had sprung up. I gently removed each poison ivy seedling from its pot and settled it into its new home. I patted the soil down around them, gave them a little water, and stood back. They looked unremarkable, innocent, just a few more green things in a sea of green. But I knew what they were. They were my sentinels, my biological landmines. My passive defense system was now active. The garden was no longer just a place of peace. It was now a place of protection. Brenda arrived that Friday afternoon right on schedule. She walked into the house with a canvas bag full of her own gardening tools slung over her shoulder, a chipper smile on her face. "I thought I'd get a little more of that weeding done for you this weekend, Cameron," she announced as if she were bestowing a great gift. "We really need to get that messy corner under control." I took a slow breath, keeping my voice even. "Actually, Brenda, I'd really appreciate it if you stayed out of the garden this weekend. I put down some special soil treatments and the ground really shouldn't be disturbed." It was the perfect excuse. Vague, technical enough to sound plausible, and a clear, direct request. It was a final test, a final chance for her to listen. She waved her hand dismissively, just as I knew she would. "Oh, don't be silly. A little light weeding won't hurt a thing. You worry too much." And that was it. She bypassed the patio, marching with determination toward her target. I just stayed in the kitchen, watching through the window over the sink, a cup of coffee growing cold in my hands. This was it, the moment of truth. She went directly to the corner plot, a woman on a mission. She set her bag down, pulled on her gloves, and knelt in the dirt. My heart was pounding. She started pulling at the clover and dandelions near the edge, her hands moving with that aggressive tearing motion she called weeding. Then she moved deeper into the plot. Her hands plunged into the exact area where I had planted my 5 little soldiers. I watched as her gloved fingers brushed against their leaves, once, twice. She pulled up a thistle that was growing right next to one of the seedlings, her knuckles grazing the innocent-looking foliage. She was completely oblivious. The urushiol oil, the plant's invisible venom, was now on her gloves, on the skin of her wrists above the cuff. She spent a good 20 minutes out there tidying up. When she was finished, she stood up, brushing her hands on her pants. She pulled off her gloves, and then in a final, fateful act, she used the back of her now bare hand to wipe a bead of sweat from her forehead. She looked at her work, nodded with satisfaction, and walked back towards the house, leaving my garden and my trap behind. The weekend was tense. I was waiting for the other shoe to drop, but the reaction to poison ivy is a slow, creeping thing. It lulls you into a false sense of security. By Sunday evening, when she and my wife's father left, nothing had happened. She gave me a patronizing pat on the shoulder on her way out. "See, your garden just needs a firm hand, Cameron. It's looking better already." The call came on Tuesday. I was working in my home office when I heard my wife's voice from the living room. It started with the normal pleasantries, then shifted. Her tone became laced with concern, then outright alarm. "Oh my God, Mom, that sounds awful on your arms and your hands. What does it look like? Blisters." "Oh, Mom." I walked out to the living room, putting on my most concerned face. My wife looked up at me, her eyes wide with worry. "It's Mom," she whispered, covering the phone's receiver. "She has some kind of horrible blistering rash all over her hands and arms. She says it's itching so bad she can't sleep." When she got off the phone, the story came tumbling out. Brenda was in agony. She was convinced she'd been attacked by some kind of aggressive new weed in my garden. She described it as a mutant plant that must have been lurking in my overgrown wild soil. According to her, my lack of proper maintenance had created a breeding ground for botanical horrors. I played my part perfectly. I feigned shock, then deep concern. "That's terrible. Are you sure it was from my garden? I haven't seen anything like that out there." Maybe she brushed up against something in her own yard. My wife looked at me, a flicker of doubt in her eyes. "I don't know, honey. She seems pretty sure. She said it started the day after she was weeding here. Are you positive you don't have anything weird growing out there?" The friction was real. She was worried about her mother, and I was the prime suspect. "Babe, I promise you, I know every plant in that garden. There's nothing dangerous out there." I lied, looking her straight in the eye. It was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do, but it was necessary. Plausible deniability was my shield. A week later, after a miserable ordeal involving a trip to an urgent care clinic, 2 different prescription creams, and a course of steroids, the final verdict came in. My wife called me with an update. Brenda was finally starting to heal. The doctor had confirmed it was a classic severe case of contact dermatitis from poison ivy. And then came the words I had been waiting for, the sweet sound of victory. She says she's developed a severe allergy. My wife explained a note of resignation in her voice. Not just to the plant, but she thinks it's something in your soil. She says your whole garden is a hot zone for her now. She declared she can never ever set foot in it again, for her own safety. She had done it herself. She had pronounced her own sentence. It wasn't me banning her. It was a medical necessity, a self-preservation instinct. She had built the wall, not me. The sabotage was over, permanently. The next Saturday morning, I walked out to my garden. The air was fresh, the sun was warm. I walked over to the corner plot. There they were, my 5 leafy sentinels standing guard their leaves, glossy in the morning light. They were untouched. The entire area was untouched. Brenda's reign of terror was officially over. I knelt down this time on my own terms. I had a tray of new seedlings next to me, a special variety of heirloom tomato, the very same kind she had destroyed. I dug a hole far from my little guardians and gently placed the new plant into the earth. I looked around at my 15-20-foot plot of land. It was quiet. It was peaceful. It was mine. My sanctuary, once violated, was now secure. And as I patted the soil around the base of that tomato plant, I smiled. The garden had fought back, and it had won.